This is chapter 35, Money Creation. Very important chapter explaining how the banking system creates money. The minute a bank makes a loan, the money supply increases by that amount. So a sound banking system is obviously very important. Let's see. So fractional reserve banking is what we have in the United States, and most countries have, I guess. It just means that banks hold only a fraction of reserves at the bank or on reserve at the Fed. Every bank in the United States is a member of the Federal Reserve System of the United States, and the Fed determines what they have to hold against checkable deposits. So fractional reserve banking started with the goldsmiths years ago when gold was being used as a medium of exchange. They were given a receipt to store their gold in a safe. And the goldsmiths realized they could just make loans by issuing receipts in amounts more than the gold they had in storage. And receipts were used as money. People didn't ask for their gold, so they just used receipts. Of course, there was a problem if everybody wanted their gold at the same time, but that rarely happened. So, characteristics: banks create money through lending. Banks are subject to panics, but not anymore, really, because in 1933, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was established, FDIC, and that was to insure deposits and get people to trust banks again after the Great Depression. So they're not really subject to panics anymore, but they do create money through the lending process, and it's very important that they do. So we're going to look at a simple balance sheet and how banks get started, and then how they create money. So basic balance sheet has assets equal liabilities plus net worth, and both sides have to balance always. So we're going to look at creating a bank, a brand new bank, a very small bank, when they start accepting deposits, and then they can make loans with their excess reserves. So definition of reserves: bank deposits at the Fed plus vault cash. Every bank has vault cash, and they also have reserves at the Fed. Every bank's a member of the Fed, and the Fed is the banker's bank. So let's look at a simple transaction and say that in Wahoo, a bank is getting started and a group of investors gets together, because banks are privately owned, all of them are, and they got together some stock money, some money to invest, and so now there is a net worth of $250,000 and cash of $250,000 to get started with this bank. And the first thing they need to do, of course, is get a charter with the state, and then they can start accepting deposits. So let's say that this particular bank decides to have a building, property, and equipment worth $240,000. So that leaves them $10,000 left in cash. And again, reserves are bank vault cash plus deposits at the Fed. So they're basically the same thing, same purpose. So of course, all banks don't have property. USAA Savings Bank is just an online bank. So now this bank's ready to accept deposits. Very important. Checkable deposits are a liability to a bank, because if you have a checking account, that bank owes you that amount in the checking account. So let's say they get deposits of $100,000. That means the asset side cash has to also increase by $100,000. So let's look at some important definitions here. Required reserves. The Federal Reserve determines the percentage of checkable deposits a bank has to hold to be in compliance. It's called the reserve ratio, and that's set by the Fed. So let's look at this. This is a very important slide. The Fed can establish and vary the reserve requirements within limits set by Congress. As you see, they can set it from 8 to 14%. Currently, it's basically 10% for over $110 million. They only have to hold reserves against checkable deposits, not against savings account money, only checkable deposits because it's the most volatile. And a very important bullet point, required reserves help the Fed control the lending abilities of commercial banks. That is the only purpose of reserves, control. Control the lending abilities. It's not going to prevent a run on banks. They only have to hold 10%. The book example uses 20%, but it's easy to take 20% for an example. So let's say that the bank deposits all of its cash on reserve at the Fed. Again, it doesn't make any difference. Cash and reserves are basically the same thing. They are both an asset to a bank. So remember that. Cash and reserves are assets, checkable deposits liabilities to a bank. So very important definitions here. Excess reserves are the actual or total reserves minus required reserves. And required reserves are checkable deposits times the reserve ratio, again, that percentage set by the Fed. So, for example, if checkable deposits are $100,000 and the reserve ratio is 20%, this particular bank has to hold $20,000 and then safely can lend $80,000. If the bank had $200,000 in checkable deposits, they would have to hold 20% of that, or $40,000, in order to be in compliance. So that's what the Fed has to hold. So let's say that someone wrote a check and the checkable deposits were $100,000. So now the bank has to honor that check. So checkable deposits go down by $50,000. So do the assets or reserves, because they had to pay that. So let's say that the bank made a loan and the customer put that amount of that loan in their checking account. Of course, they're going to spend it really quickly because they didn't borrow it to let it sit there. So another important definition here, loan is an asset to a bank. Loans are assets. So let's say that the loan was $50,000. So that person deposited it in their checking account. So now the loan is an asset. It goes up by $50,000. Checkable deposits go up by $50,000 as well. But when that loan clears, or when that person spends that money in the checking account, then checkable deposits goes down by $50,000. So do reserves. So important blue box down there, a single bank can lend only an amount equal to its pre-loan excess reserves. So now this bank with $50,000 in checkable deposits, if the reserve ratio is 20%, they have to have $10,000 on reserves, and they do. So this bank would not be able to make any more loans. But when they did make that loan of $50,000, the money supply increased by that amount of that loan. So another way that a bank can make money if they have reserves and can't lend it, they can buy securities from the government or from a securities dealer. Remember, securities are Treasury bills, notes, bonds, U.S. savings bonds, and banks own a lot of those. So they do get interest from those securities. They get better interest rate on loans, but it's better than nothing. So they can also have securities as an asset, and then new money is created. We'll look at that more in the next chapter. But this chapter is mainly using the tool of the Fed, that is the reserve requirement. So conflicting goals, banks have to make a profit. They make loans to earn interest. They can buy securities to earn interest, but they have to maintain liquidity. Banks don't know who is going to come in on any given day and take out all their money. Hopefully it's not a big company. But if they don't have their reserves, they must have them to comply with the Fed. So generally, they borrow overnight from another bank and pay the federal funds rate, which is set by the Fed. It's the rate banks charge each other to borrow, the Fed funds rate. That's usually what we hear about when the Federal Reserve meets. So banks have to earn a profit, and they make loans mainly to earn profits. So let's say that we're going to now enter the money multiplier definition. It works a lot like the Keynesian multiplier we covered in a previous chapter. But let's say that banks are at a point where they are all loaned up and they can't make any more loans. because they all have their 20% in required reserves, and they've lent all their excess reserves, which is not likely to happen. But let's say that it did. And someone finds a $100 bill. That $100 bill was in the money supply before, but it can't really expand the money supply until it is put in a bank. So multiple deposits can be created from that $100. Remember, banks have to hold 20% in this example. So the bank has to hold $20 of that $100 if someone deposited it, and they could safely lend $80. So new money created $80 in the first transaction. Let's say that the money, someone bought something with that loan and deposited that wherever they borrowed it from, deposited the money in Bank B. So Bank B now has $80. They have to hold 16, can safely lend 64, and so on. So that the process will continue, but we could, so the money supply could totally increase by $400 from that original $80. But what we can do here is determine the money multiplier, which is 1 divided by the required reserve ratio. So 1 over 0.2 equals 5. The original $80 in Bank A times 5 would be $400. The money supply could potentially increase by $400. That would be assuming that everybody that borrowed that money deposited the entire amount of that loan, and there was no cash leakage and no excess reserves, even though we know there always are. But potentially the money supply could increase by $400. It's going to be in reality something less than that. But that's what the money multiplier is. 1 over the required reserve ratio. So if the required reserve ratio is 10%, 1 over 0.1 is 10. If it's 0.2, as in the example, 1 over 0.2 is 5. If it's 25%, 1 over 0.25 is 4. So we see in the visual that the bank system could create $400 new money created by the lending process. So the money multiplier shows the maximum amount of new money created by a single dollar of excess reserves. Remember, excess reserves are what a bank can safely lend. So the higher the reserve ratio, the lower the money multiplier. And it is reversible as well. Making loans creates money. Very important bullet point. Loan repayment destroys money. So the lending process and the solvency of banks is very important to monetary policy. So we're not really going to cover anything about leverage, but modern banks do use a lot of leverage, and small losses can drive banks into insolvency. Obviously, that doesn't happen very often, but in 2007 to 2009, with the recession we had then, banks did have to be bailed out by the Federal Reserve. And we'll see in a later chapter other tools of the Federal Reserve.